Welcome to the Strand, and thank you all for coming. We're truly honored to host a conversation this evening celebrating the life and work of an incredible talent, the late photographer, painter, and polymath, Gert Berliner. It is my pleasure to introduce two men who played influential roles in the narrative of Gert's fascinating life. Marshall Brooks is a longtime publisher and author. Marshall began his career in publishing in 1971, reading manuscripts for Harry Smith at his legendary publishing house, The Smith. In 1979, he created Arts and Books, the same house that recently published a new collection of Gert's photographs entitled About People. He is the author of several works, including, but not limited to, the books Paperback Island and A Brief Illustrated History of the Bookshelf. Joining Marshall in conversation this evening is Gert's son and senior business editor at NPR, Uri Berliner. His work at NPR has been recognized with a Peabody Award, a Loeb Award, Edward R. Monroe Award, a Society of Professional Journalists New America Award, and has been twice honored by the RTDNA. In addition, he was the recipient of a Nieman Fellowship at Harvard University. We're very fortunate to have these two men who knew Gert so well sit down with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming first Marshall to say a few words, and then Uri, and as well as the book About People to the Strand.
Thank you. I want to make a few brief comments, and then we're going to launch right into our discussion. Many months ago, this evening was planned as a book signing. And with Gert's passing in late March, it has now become this memorial event on the occasion of the publication of this book. Up until the very end, Gert demonstrated a determination that this event happen, and it is very much in the spirit of his special determination that we are gathered here tonight. I would especially like to thank the Strand bookstore for making this memorial event possible, and for the generous allocation of their rare book room for our use. Cynthia Gray, Lila Zwanitzer in particular, and Nick have been most thoughtful and responsive throughout the entire process of arranging this special evening. I would like to thank Frances Ehrlich Berliner, Gert's wife, for her steadfast support over the 12-month long bookmaking process. We began almost exactly a year ago working on this book. Lastly, I would like to thank all of the book's early supporters and advocates. Their support means a lot, especially for a book of a very special book of this sort that has a limited print run and so on and so forth. So it's a very intimate style of publishing. With that, I would like to join Uri and begin our discussion. Uri, any preliminary thoughts on the book overall when you first encountered it?
I was kind of overwhelmed because I knew a lot of these pictures individually, and I'd seen the solitary walkers. I had seen the subway pictures. Of course, I'd seen the pictures of myself, but I'd never just encountered them all in one place, collected really gave me a whole new sense of my father's outlook and his perspective and his relationship, especially to New York, which was really fascinating in this book because my father was a refugee. He left Germany and went to Sweden, and spent the war years in Sweden, and then came to New York, and I think he fell right into the life of New York. It was a very fertile time, creative time, the Beat era. But I don't think my father ever felt himself to be a New Yorker. He always felt like an outsider. He was a refugee. And you see in these pictures, I mean, I hope that people can look at some of them, that this is the perspective of someone who sees it from the outside. He's fascinated by everything. The walkers, the people on the subway, the gangs of kids, but he's not of the city. He's shooting from the distance. He has the outsider's eye.
Right. Uri, you grew up in New York.
I did, yeah.
So, from an insider's viewpoint,
yeah.
How do the photographs come across? I mean, you've done a good job, I think, describing where Gert was coming from. But do you think it's a New York that still exists, or does it resonate with your memories, etc.?
I mean, I don't think visually it exists anymore. I think the spirit of New York is the same, both the intensity of it and the loneliness of it. And I think those are the things he captured so much, the way that people are alone, and then they're also thrust together in these weird situations, like sitting on the subway pressed against a total stranger. So that never changes. But the way the city looks, wow, it's different. It really is, yeah. I mean, some of those pictures, like the ones back in the 50s, that's like straight out of West Side Story, right?
It's true.
Yeah.
Do you remember him? When was he taking his photographs? Do you remember him as, a boy doing this?
I remember as some of my very first memories are of him with the camera.
Right.
I mean, I think there's a picture of me with a little naked boy smelling a rose. I don't know if I remember that, but but yes, I remember him taking photographs, always sort of looking for a shot and putting me in a lot of photographs. And I didn't mind. I liked it, which is weird because I hate being photographed now. But when I was little, I liked it.
You better hold on to your chair, Uri. I think you hold the record for the most likenesses in the book. I think I counted at least 4. And
yeah, right.
And there's some really nice photographs, especially the ones of you at play with other boys.
Yeah.
At the beach.
I think
Long
my father loved those pictures. He thought
Yeah.
we were all wrestling, a bunch of us kids, and he said it was like a dance, and I guess I could see that. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I think you were having a good time.
Yeah, we were. Yeah.
So, I don't know the answer to this. Was Gert self-taught with the camera, or?
He was completely self-taught, and my father was self-taught about everything, because he left Berlin when he was 14. So I guess that would be like a year of high school. When he was in Sweden, he didn't go to school. He worked, he played around, and he worked. And at that time, though, I think he studied art. He went to museums. He started to think about art and paintings mostly, but he became fascinated by art and a number of Mondrian and some other artists that made a big impression on him. And then when he came to the States, he fell right in with some artists, photographers, cinematographers. So I think he just picked up a camera. He had a great eye. He had a really good eye, and I don't think that was. I don't know if that's something you can teach yourself. It's something that happens.
No, and there are repeated instances of these moments in the book, and one or two you can okay, someone got lucky.
Right.
But he had that knack for being in the right place at the right time and having this extraordinary eye.
Right.
And there's a photograph with the police admonishing a boy. And, yeah, the timing of it is extraordinary.
I don't think
It's unpaginated.
there's no numbers.
It's after the series of walkers in the subway, but yeah. So, Francis.
Francis?
So I asked him, I said, how did you get that picture? He said, I was there.
He was there. So I hope everybody can see this picture, or you can pass it around, because it's, and this is my dad, because my dad was, he bristled at authority. Nobody was going to tell him what to do. He did not like authority figures at all. And so to me, this picture is the essence of my father. It's two burly cops, one of them wagging his finger at a little boy. They've got him surrounded, and the little boy's like saying, I'm not going to take any of this crap. He's smirking right back at them. and I think my father definitely saw himself in that little boy.
Oh, I think that's an excellent point. He also could bristle at publishers. I might share that.
Could bristle at just about everybody, right?
Yeah. So, Uri, your dad was in a very intense. I was explaining to someone earlier tonight that he was in New York at a time when, right around here, the most extraordinary people
Yeah.
were walking down the sidewalk and doing all kinds of things and creating art and memorable art, creating history. Do you remember these people? Do you have memories of some of the movers and the shakers that?
Mostly I heard about them.
Yeah.
I remember Marian Maggid, who was, she's pictured in the book in a few places. She was a writer and editor at Commentary magazine. But, and my father was, I mean, you can see he took photographs of filmmakers, the Makis brothers. He took photographs of musicians, Visconti, and writers, James T. Farrell, among others. And then he really, somehow he got connected to this world of small intellectual magazines in New York in the early 60s. There was a lot of sort of driven intellectual people who were starting small magazines. So he got pictures of the editors and writers at Commentary, and then the New York Review of Books. One of them was a right-leaning, and the other was a left-leaning, right. And I guess they were big rivals, and my father managed somehow to get in with both of them.
Shortly before your dad died, we met and we were talking about whether this evening was going to go forward as the book signing, and Gert, I think, very much wanted to do it. And in the process of having that discussion, some of his subjects came up.
Mm-hmm.
And you remember the story about Buckley?
Yeah, he had a. It's not in this book, but he had a photo spread of William F. Buckley as a youngish publisher of the National Review and conservative intellectual. My father's politics could not have been more different than William F. Buckley, and he said that he was assigned to shoot Buckley, and he had every intention of of making him look bad and ugly in the photographs. But he said he couldn't do it. He said he came out looking pretty good. He said he really tried, but he couldn't do it.
Buckley kind of had a Teflon thing going on. And you can see there's a Dan Wakefield book on, I believe, New York in the 1950s or 60s, which I bought at the Strand a few years ago. And that photograph, one of the Buckley photographs, is in there. And that's something that I would like to mention, is that Gert's work, it got out there. You pick up a copy of the New York Review of Books, or you watch a movie about the New York Review of Books, or a Dan Wakefield book, and lo and behold, there's a Gert photograph. And in an uncanny way, people found their way to his work all throughout the time that I knew him, and I knew him for about 14, 15 years. And I was saying to Uri before we came on, I some months would pass by and I hadn't seen Gert. I'd come to New York, go up to the apartment, and what's been happening? Nothing. Except for, I've just been given this award, or they want to use, New York Magazine has a spread coming out, and people would find him very often. It's not that he had a PR firm.
No, he was about as anti-PR as
Yeah.
he could possibly be.
Yeah. And I was telling Uri, to me, it's a very positive experience that someone's work, had that undeniable quality factor that always seemed to win people over.
Yeah, my father had an unusual life, and a long life, but a very eventful life. And what was really remarkable is a lot of eventful things happened to my dad really late in life, in his 90s. I mean, that doesn't happen, but in his 90s, the following things happened. He rediscovered and found family that he did not know existed in Sweden through a toy monkey that he donated to a museum. He was reconnected to the family that rescued him in Sweden and became very good friends with this sprawling family of Furstenbergs. He had a show of his photographs in Berlin, and we were fortunate enough to work together on a story about all this for NPR, sort of about how his toy monkey reconnected him with his relatives and his family. All of this happened after his 90th birthday. So never say never.
And for people who have not read the NPR pieces that Uri did, he did 2 stories on his dad in November of last year. Those are online, and they're must-reads.
Listen to the radio version. The radio part's better.
Okay.
What's that?
Right.
Yes, you can hear my father's voice, and it's very powerful. And he had a great voice for radio. I mean, it really came across. It really did. The accent, the intonation. It was really, really very, very effective.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about is that this is a little bit of a departure. There are quite a few photographs of Long Island in the book,
Right, yeah.
and some of them feature you.
Yep.
But I think Long Island played a large role in your dad's life and your own. You want to speak a little
Yeah.
bit about the Long Island experience?
So I think my dad started going out to the east end of Long Island to Sag Harbor and then Amagansett, I think in the late 50s. I mean, when it was cheap, and anybody could rent a little beach shack, and so I have a lot of early memories of being out there with him in the summer, like when I'm playing on the beach there. And eventually, Francis and Gert bought a house out there, really lovely little house, and they spent many, many summers. How long did you have that place? 35 years. And then I became very attached to the place. When I got my first job in journalism, it was out there in the local paper. So we both have a pretty deep connection to the place. Yeah.
I'm going to hop back to Manhattan from Long Island. I believe your dad told me that he met Robert Frank in Washington Square Park, and they were both minding children.
Right. That's
now,
right.
Is that a...
That's a true fact. Yeah. There they were, these two refugees with little kids in strollers in Washington Square Park, and they struck up a friendship. Washington Square Park there was a lot going on in Washington Square Park. I mean, that was the place. I remember being there a lot as a kid, and there was also chess. Like, there were always chess games going on. My father played chess there a lot. I think he started playing chess with Stanley Kubrick, and Kubrick, I think, was a really good chess player, and like beat my dad all the time. But he was really good. But yeah, everybody used to go there and hang out. I mean, there was music. There was like the what was it called? The band shell? Was it like the yeah? And so there was folk music, and then there was like the chess scene, and then there were the kids in the strollers, and then of course later there were the drug dealers, and yeah, it had everything.
Here's a picture of Robert Frank, actually two. So. Gert worked on at least 3 Frank films.
Yep.
2 of them as cinematographer, and he also, I think, supplied the script for one of them.
Yep.
And infamously was a assistant on Pull My Daisy, which is, I think, just about everyone was there. Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg,
Yep.
so on and so forth. And the word from on high, meaning your dad, he did not like Kerouac, characterized him as an anti-Semite, but really respected Ginsberg's. He thought he was a very intelligent, bright guy. That was one of the, for a civilian such as myself, that was one of the wild things about having coffee or breakfast with your dad. It wasn't so much shared interests as your end of it would be a shared interest. His part of it would be that it was part of his life. And Kubrick came up once when we were having breakfast, and in a very New York coffee shop on Broadway, not too far from the Beacon Theater, and it's going through the back of your mind. I mean, he actually knew this guy. You're talking about when you first saw 2001, and Gert tells you, yes, he was my witness when I became a citizen.
Yeah.
And so there was this extra dimension to knowing your dad that was wild.
I think a lot of it had to do with this neighborhood, Greenwich Village, and I think back in those days it was kind of like a small town, and everybody just kept bumping into each other and knocking each other around, and there, you could rent an apartment for cheap, a cold water flat, and everybody was doing something, writing, painting, making a documentary or avant-garde movie, and they all knew each other. And one of the ways they knew each other has nothing to do with this book, was my father, my mother, and several of their friends started a coffee house on McDougal Street called Rienzi. It was like I think it was like one of the very first coffee houses in New York, and they had no idea what they were doing. They had absolutely no idea what they were doing. But they had an espresso machine, and they tapped into something, and like when it opened, there were lines down the street, and it became like this raging success where everybody used to go and hang out. And, the beat poets, the artists, all the village, crazy people who were like working on the same novel for 25 years, and then you found out they didn't really write anything. It was just a bunch of scribbles. They were there too. They were all there and in the Rienzi, and I think that's one of the ways they knew a lot of these people. They were like really far ahead of their times though with this coffee house.
I turned to it. Mm-hmm. And I also have a Post-it note, which helped me turn to it. I walked past this location today, and this is in support of what Uri just said about the neighborhood and things happening right around here. One of my favorite all-time artists is Ad Reinhardt, and have people seen Ad Reinhardt's black painting at MoMA? It has an iron protective device in front of it because so many people go up and kick it that they are checked by this little railing. So imagine my excitement when I'm having coffee with Gert, and I might have said something like, we're talking about painting and painters, and I said, yeah, well, I like that guy, Ad Reinhardt. And Gert said, oh, we shared a studio. And more important, he gave me a bed. or possibly Gert gave him a bed. They knew each other well. So this is Ad Reinhardt. Back in the day when you could have a studio on Broadway, and folks, this is just down the road, and it faces Waverly Place, and it's a second floor, and it's still there. Those windows are very distinctive, and if you go stand in front of Waverly Place and look over at Broadway, you'll see Ad's studio. So that was one of the delights of knowing Gert, is that it intensified one's appreciation of New York, and you could actually visit a lot of these very special places. I think you have, is that 10th Street, Uri?
Yeah, it says East 10th Street, right down the block.
Just down the block.
I don't know if you can see this, but this is a picture of a woman carrying a painting of herself. and this is like, you got to be lucky and you got to be good, but you also got to spend a lot of time out on the street to get a picture like this. And I think that's one thing I like to think about my dad, is just walking the streets, just being there. Like, it's street photography. It's like, and that's, New York is a place to do it, where you just are walking, and then you find the right picture. The other thing that I didn't know about my father's photography until maybe just like 2 months ago was how he got all these pictures on the subway. I don't know if you've had a chance to see them, but there's a whole series of photographs of people on the subway, alone, in pairs, people who are happy to be with each other, people who are disgusted by each other, but they're very intimate pictures. And I just a few months ago, I said, how did you get those pictures? Because first of all, you're not allowed to take pictures on the subway. I think it's against the law. But he said he didn't really care about that. But also, like, how did you take the pictures? So he told me he had, I think it was a Pentax. It was a camera that had a very quiet shutter. He had set the f-stop and the shutter speed He knew exactly what it had to be. He had the camera on his lap, and he would just look straight ahead, not down at the camera, and take the pictures. And, you know, they're so personal. They are, clearly these people don't know they're being taken, they're photographed, but which is weird because, like, why shouldn't you be allowed to take pictures on the subway? I guess I can see why, but if you don't take pictures on the subway, this is a huge part of New York life, is the life of the subway. So if no one's ever allowed to take a picture on the subway, it's like a whole part of New York that would never get chronicled. So I'm so glad he took these pictures. The subway, it's really different than the way the subway looks now. I guess it would be easy to take pictures on the subway now with an iPhone or something, but these pictures really, I just am always amazed when I see them.
This is a digression.
Yeah.
Anyone here from Fashion Row, the fashion industry, or?
Yes.
Oh, that's right. Okay, Francis. Okay, Francis. You're going to be my reigning authority. I was looking at these, well, first of all, to back up, I don't know how many times I've seen these images because working on the book, I've seen them a lot. And I've looked at the Subway series, and I've looked at the walkers on the sidewalk. Many, many times. And it was only the other night when I was getting ready to come to New York, and these people are really dressed. I love this woman with her collar, the hair, etc. But here's the thing, Francis. The size of the buttons, I was mentioning this to a friend tonight, the size of the buttons on the women's garments are the size of cookies. Everyone has them. And by bringing this up tonight, I'm hoping to plant a seed, and in the next, month or two, big buttons are going to, but
There was no Velcro.
No Velcro, right.
is that a brooch? This woman has got. They're in there. So it's an amazing fashion document in addition to the the human interest element, and again the quality of clothing really impressive. I mean, just the people dressed much differently back then, and this, of course, the Lena Wertmuller look.
Oh, yeah.
So, Uri, do you have a particularly favorite
Subway
photograph?
picture?
Well, any photograph, or it's hard to narrow them down.
Well, Francis and I were just talking about this one because there's so much going on in this photograph here. It's a woman with a shopping bag on the subway, and her face is framed by the handle of the shopping bag. But then if you look closely, her expression is a lot like the little boy's expression in the advertisement there. It's just really weird, and it's just an amazing picture. The ice cream cones, there are two women eating ice cream cones. It's a lovely photograph. And then speaking of fashion, you don't see hats like this right now. You just don't see that. Yeah. What?
I think there's writing in the back.
There's writing in there. And we're not going to mention the name of that book there, though, because it says Barnes & Nobles. And I worked here at the Strand when I got out of college. So I didn't last very long. But
Well, the Strand was a different place back then. We were briefly talking about that, and I was again telling the friend of the family that when I first started coming to the Strand, it It was a little bit scary. You had to surrender your bags.
That's right. Yeah.
You were given half of a playing card, and the dudes taking your bag. Your bags were taken so that you didn't put books in your bag. Yeah, I think they were on clothespins, possibly.
Yep, they were. That's right. Yep.
Yeah, there were some scary-looking guys, and it was very dark. It was a very dark bookstore.
Yeah.
Which I loved, but to
so there's some of my father's pictures were kind of political, and this one, I think, was this picture almost needs no description. It's called Dream, and it's, if you can see, it's a young guy staring at the hood ornament of a really fancy car. I think it might be it's a Rolls Royce, and it's just the desire. You can just see it burning from his eyes, and it's like really a New York picture, really is. And I think that's my father's outsider view to capture that, seeing that.
Uri, did Gert ever own a car?
He owned many Rolls Royces.
Yeah.
No, he did.
I can't quite picture him.
He did. Let me see. There was a VW Bug, I remember. Third-hand Dodge Maverick. I remember a Citroen, maybe? I think so. Yep. Yeah, a lot of cars that needed work.
Okay. I'm going to explain briefly how I met Gert. There was a book of poetry by this novelist who put out a book of poetry, Jim Farrell. And there was a great photograph of Farrell on the back cover taken outside of the Chelsea Hotel. And the publisher neglected to put the photo credit on the dust jacket. One day I found a press photo or a publicity photo of the same photograph, and it had the credit below the photo, and it said Gert Berliner. And I got a hold of the white pages of New York City, and I was really curious if this person had memories of Jim Farrell. And I called. There was a listing for Gert Berliner in Manhattan. I called up. Gert answered the phone, and the rest is history. And there was this big pause because it had been 40 years since he had taken the photograph. It was he had taken it in 1963, and he was shocked that someone was calling up about this photo, and there was some dead air there. And then he said, and I had been complimentary about the photograph. I said, it's really a great photograph. I have better ones. And immediately invited me to see the better ones in New York City. I came down, a very organized man, and he had everything laid out. And I was, these things were gold to me. I said, man, what a stash. And then I started blubbering about, gosh, I'd like to be able to do something with these someday, but I know it's hard to, I was thinking about dark rooms and negatives, and he said, let's go across the street. And there was this fantastic copy shop. They sold film, and they had these unbelievable machines that would make basically kind of screened prints that were almost instantly ready for reproduction. And he was very, very generous. And So we met through Jim Farrell, and very quickly the story is that it was a Robert Frank assignment that for the Herald Tribune, and Frank couldn't do it or didn't want to do it, and he asked Gert if Gert wanted the gig. And your dad also told me that he was doing photography in order to support his painting, in support of his painting career. He and Farrell went to the Chelsea Hotel, and then they walked from 23rd Street down to Bleecker Street. And this building is still in the neighborhood. They went to this colossal flop house called the Mills Hotel, which is still there.
Yeah.
It's huge. And they're working on it. They're giving it a facelift. They went through the building. Farrell was in his element there because, these were his people. And Gert ended up taking one of the most otherworldly photographs of an American author. And this is Jim Farrell, like we call it the preacher shot at the Mills. Farrell was not that old at the time either. He was in his 50s, but boy, he was something went on, or was going on in his mind. And so again, Gert had those special moments. They never met again. It was a one-time meeting, and all the other photographs are equally interesting. Well, not quite on this level, but they're neat.
So can you talk a little more about how you put the book together, how you published it? You said you met him, you went to the copy shop, and where to go from there?
Well, that was the Farrell photographs. This book had its origins in, we met for coffee one day a couple of years ago, and your father had done, he had visited the camps in Europe in 1968, and he had photographed them. And he wanted to know, he wanted it in book form. He wanted these photographs in book form. And he was very intense about this project. And I said, well, that can be done, and it can be done relatively inexpensively, and so on and so forth. So we did this book called Silent Places. And based on that experience, I think your dad realized that it was possible to take a bunch of photographs and to put them in book form, and that it was physically achievable. So some time goes by, and he wanted to know if I'd be interested in doing this book. Actually, Gert and Francis. And I said, sure. And quite frankly, I thought in the back of my mind, oh yeah, the subways, that'd make a nice book, or the people walking on the I love the Sidewalk Series. These people did not know they were being photographed, and there are, I forget how many, maybe a dozen. I was expecting one of these series, or maybe both the series, and a year ago I went to visit Gert, and out come the two series, and I said, okay, great.
Yeah.
Then Gert goes back to the sideboard, and another box comes out, and then a third box. And I had no idea that all of this was in the pipeline. I took the photograph, and they're close to 90 photographs. So a year ago, I came down, took the photographs, took them back to Vermont to be scanned by the one guy who had a machine that could scan them. And that's how it came to. It was very much a kind of coffee shop scenario in many ways.
But he was really happy to have this book published, and It's and when you see them all together, I think it's even more effective. But this series of walkers, all the lonely people, it ran in New York Magazine too recently, right? It did. And if you look at them, I mean, it's great because the walls or the gates, so it's a perfect backdrop. And like, there's so much you can tell about these people. There are people who are kind of shuffling and broken down. And then there are like people who are like sort of striding, like with this crazy ambition, like real New Yorkers. You can tell they're going somewhere really fast. Yeah, and I guess the idea of photographing people alone against a backdrop of a wall, there's something about it that's really very, very powerful.
I think of all the photographs, when I see the, and there's some posters here tonight, which you're welcome to take one, and they feature some of these pedestrian shots. I think the series to me is very, when I see the series, to me it's synonymous with your dad and his. I'm being given the high sign. Uri.
Oh, okay, all right, high sign.
Yep, the hook is coming.
All right,
so
okay. We've yammered on.
When it does. Oh. I was going to say we have time for some questions or comments from anyone from the audience, for the speakers, anything about Gert?
Yep. Please, anybody who wants to share anything, it doesn't have to be a question.
We're up in the front. Here you go, sir.
I have to confess that I came to an appreciation of Gert's work very late. I live in Philadelphia, so that may be part of the reason. The other is that explains a great many things, actually. I'm related to the family that Gert stayed with in Sweden, and so we had the opportunity to meet him very, very recently, and it was just a wonderful, rich, encompassing experience to meet Francis and Gert, and even way past 90, to be impressed by his intelligence, his wit, his energy, and as you can see in the photographs, his ability to, in just a fraction of a second, pull something together out of nothing that anyone else walking around the street wouldn't even notice, and to create these images that just are, capture the life in New York City. So it's just, to me, with my, having met Gert only twice, it's really an encapsulation of his intelligence and his wit and his openness and quickness. It's really quite a marvelous collection.
One more in the front.
Hello. I was wondering, you said you liked having your photo taken as a child, but you don't like it now. Do you ever think, or like, I'm not exactly familiar with your father's work, just from skimming through the book, but you said something about like a picture of like a naked child with a flower.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, that seems a little suspicious.
It seems a little what?
Creepy, if you will.
Creepy? No, I don't think so.
I don't know.
Here, you want to see it?
Yeah.
There it is.
It's innocent. Okay.
All right?
Was that taken in New Mexico?
I don't think so. I think it was in New York somewhere.
I would like to know something about the post process on, like the printing. If he was printing his own pictures, or if you have the contact sheets, and if this material is archived, or who's taking care of the whole work.
I know he does have a lot of contact sheets and negatives. I don't think he printed most of these pictures. I think he had them done at darkrooms, professional darkrooms in New York. But he has a lot of negatives, contact sheets, and I remember the grease pencil and, selecting the pictures from the contact sheets. That's the way it used to be done, right?
Oh. Here you go, ma'am. Right here.
Oh, I sort of was taken aback by hearing that Gert was involved with the creation of the Cafe Rienzi, because that was the occasion, it was one of the occasions where newly made friends and I went there. It was, to go to the village and talk about stuff. And I had my first cappuccino, which was marvelous. And also the talk got around to homosexuality. Now, it turned out that everybody at the table, the 4 people at the table, including myself, were gay. And I opened up and said I was gay too, and it was the first time I had ever opened up like that.
Really? Wow.
And it was, I drank a lot of cappuccino, and finally we said goodbye. It was, the Rienzi was incredibly wonderful, with all this sort of mythic place to me there when I started going to the village. And then I went home. I went to the subway to go home. And I was so overcome that I threw up. I threw up all those cappuccinos. Because it was a very frightening experience in a lot of ways.
Did you go back?
Oh, many
You
times.
did. Good.
Many, many times.
Yeah,
And, ate. What did they have there? They had dessert and.
They had some dessert, right? They had
Yeah.
pastries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I ate that.
And there's another representative of the Rienzi legacy, Anne Durant. Her mother, Joan Durant, was one of the founders of the Rienzi too. So we're represented here, right? Right.
Yeah. Oh.
Thank you. Oop.
Gert really liked this sweater. Gert really liked this sweater. He said it looked like a late Mark Rothko painting.
Drop the mic.
Sorry. That might be a good note to end on. Mark Rothko. Uri and Marshall, thank you so much for having this conversation with us.